Alright guys, how's it going? Just over a year ago I released this video. It's been a bad week at Intel, and at the start of this video I discussed how Intel had quite a lot of problems at the beginning of their transition to 14nm. They had serious yield problems around late 2013, and I noted that in their own slides they claimed that yield was rapidly increasing, on track to match their 22nm yields only 1 quarter later. But it's safe to say that that didn't quite happen, and in a later slide, late 2015 in fact, they were still trending to match 22nm yields. Now whether they got there or not, I'm not entirely sure. They probably have got there by now, because they've been on 14nm for a very, very long time. Essentially this spelled the end of Intel's tick-tock. That had now become Process Architecture Optimization, which later became Process Architecture Optimization. As a reminder, the process switch would have been the Broadwell architecture. The next architecture update, that is the old talk, would have been Skylake. They then optimised 14nm for Kaby Lake, and then once again optimised 14nm for Coffee Lake. So that's what this all means. Now there was another interesting point in this video. It was actually the translation of Canard PC Hardware's article on Intel around the same time last year. And number 3 was the interesting one where they talked about Fab Hell and that Intel was likely going to have a 6-month delay on 10nm. And worse still, Cannon Lake, their upcoming 10nm CPUs, were not expected to feature any significant architectural improvements. Well, only a few weeks ago we learned that indeed Intel's 10nm was broken and officially delayed until 2019. Now they're talking here about high volume production because Intel, believe it or not, is actually shipping 10nm parts right now. It is their Core i3-8121U processor, and we know by now that U signifies low power. But here we can see it's just launched in the second quarter of 2018 on the 10nm lithography. We don't have a recommended price yet. I've got a feeling they may be giving these away for pretty cheap though. But what is really interesting about this is this. This will basically be what this chip looks like. You've got your GT2 EUs, this is all your graphics, and you've got 2 cores and you've got your Encore. This is Skylake GT2. However, going back to what they said over at Canard PC about Cannon Lake, that is the 10nm version, this 8121U would not be a significant architectural advancement. So basically you are looking at this CPU here, except it will be much smaller due to the 10nm node compared to the 14nm node of Skylake. And scrolling down a bit to the performance, 2 cores, 4 threads, 2.2 GHz base frequency and a 3.2 GHz turbo at 15 watts. So this was released yesterday and it didn't take very long for people to figure that something was seriously amiss with it. And in fact you need only look at the Kaby Lake i3-8130U, which was launched a quarter earlier on 14nm, and in this one they show a price, which also has 2 cores, 4 threads and also has a base frequency of 2.2 GHz. The same as this Cannon Lake 10nm chip, and a max turbo of 3.4 GHz compared to 3.2 GHz of the 8121U. And it is a 15 watt chip, so that's the same. And scrolling down we can see, yep, it's got the Intel UHD graphics 620. So this is basically it here, with base graphics frequency of 300 MHz and a graphics max dynamic frequency of 1 GHz. Now looking at the graphics frequency of the Cannon Lake 8121U, and we've run into a bit of a problem here because it doesn't appear to have any graphics. So it's got the same base clock, it is 0.2 GHz short on the maximum turbo at the same TDP, and it does not have any integrated graphics. This big blue thing here, it is missing. Well, it is actually there, it's just fused off. It either doesn't work because of yield, or there is something else drastically wrong with the chip. And over at Tom's yesterday we found out that the i3-8121U appears in the Lenovo IdeaPad 330, which is a low-end notebook that has popped up at a Chinese retailer, JD.com, and it comes with RX 540 graphics instead. And here we can clearly see the difference in clock speeds, and we should have been expecting this because we have seen from Intel's own slides that their 10nm CPUs fall slightly short of their own 14 plus performance. Remember, that was their Kaby Lake optimization, with Coffee Lake being 14 plus plus. So Intel themselves did admit that their 10nm performance, as you can see on the y-axis, they're talking about performance, which is simply clock speed really. It falls slightly short of Kaby Lake and a fair distance behind Coffee Lake. And now we have evidence of that because their first Cannon Lake CPU cannot hit the same turbo frequencies as Kaby Lake U CPU, even though it has no integrated graphics using power. Now, also of interest in that Bad Week at Intel video was where I discussed the Anantech article, where Intel said they would be moving data center first to their new node, their 10++ node. And only 5 months ago in my Intel versus AMD 2018 video, I speculated, based on all of this, that the chances of us seeing a large 10nm chip from Intel in 2018 was essentially nothing. They would basically be stuck on 14nm all year. And I included the 8-core Coffee Lake and the data center CPUs in that analysis. I simply could not see any way for Intel to release a large CPU on a broken 10nm process anytime in 2018. Middle of May 2018, and Intel presents at JP Morgan 46th Annual Global Technology, Media and Communications Conference. And this is a transcript over at Seeking Alpha. It's a pretty poor transcript in actual fact. Some of the words are all over the place, but I will do my best. Intel exec Murthy Renduchintala, who is the Chief Engineering Officer and EVP of Intel, he was speaking to analyst Harlan Sur, and the vast majority of this discussion was about the state of Intel's 10nm and what they'd be releasing for the remainder of the year and next. So I'm going to go through this and pick out the most important parts, and I'll throw in a bit of analysis as well. And it was over on page 3 where Harlan first asked about the company's core leadership in manufacturing technology. The company's sort of core leadership in manufacturing technology. Of course, we all know that Intel has had a manufacturing lead for I don't know how many decades. This lead has slipped to the point of being non-existent over the past year or two. But Harlan continues, fast forward to today, Intel has delayed the high volume ramp of 10nm, while the leading foundry guys, that's TSMC and Global Foundries, are bringing 7nm products to the market, maybe in the second half of this year. And the market's getting a little bit concerned that the gap is closing. Now obviously, Intel on 10nm and struggling, the foundry guys on 7nm, you may think the foundry guys are well ahead, but in actual fact, Intel's 10nm and the foundry guys 7nm, they're pretty similar in size. Intel has some advantages, the foundry guys have got other advantages, but Harlan continued by asking Murthy if he could just tell us why Intel had made that decision to delay the 10nm technology. And Murthy started by telling us what we already know, that Intel was actually already shipping 10nm, however in low volume. And then essentially goes on to say that this delay has all been about Intel being too aggressive with their shrink. They've targeted 2.7 times scaling. That's from 14nm down to 10nm. They have attempted 2.7 times scaling, which is a more aggressive shrink than what they tried going from 22nm down to 14nm, which was 2.4 times scaling. And he finishes by saying clearly the manufacturing group had very, very ambitious goals. It's an interesting point because we know that Intel had a lot of trouble on 14nm, and yet they've gone and tried an even more aggressive shrink from 14 to 10. And Murthy says, with hindsight, that was possibly just a little bit too aggressive. But interestingly, he claims that the issues that they have faced are not fundamental. They know what to fix, and they are busy going about fixing that. Continuing with what is for me the most interesting part of the entire interview, where he says that, in the meantime, we've found tremendous intranode capability within our 14nm process. Murthy then went on to claim that from the very first generation of their 14nm, which was their Broadwell CPUs, to the latest generation of 14nm, Coffee Lake, Intel has been able to deliver over 70% performance improvement as a result of those intranode modifications and desirable changes. Now, what exactly does this mean? 70% is an incredible improvement. That is pretty close to parity with an actual node shrink, which doesn't really seem all that realistic. There's no question that Intel made a pretty decent leap, especially I thought between Kaby Lake and Coffee Lake. There did look to be an improvement in process there, but 70% over the entire 14nm? How exactly have Intel got to that number? Well, let's take a look. If we go back to Anantech's Broadwell desktop review, the i7-5775C, which was a quad-core, 8-thread CPU. And if we just go down to Cinebench R15 multi-thread, which is often used as the standard, you can see here the i7-5775C, which was a 65-watt CPU, scores 782 Cinebench points. Fast forward a couple of years and a bit, and we're at the i7-8700K, which, as you know, has 6 cores and 12 threads. And I'm pretty sure you know where this one's going. It's also a 95-watt CPU, and it scores 1364 Cinebench R15 multi-threaded points. So let's just see, 1364 divided by, what was it, 782. And we've got 74%. So the 8700K is 74% faster than the 5775C. And Murthy said we've been able to deliver over 70% performance improvement. Right, so now we know exactly what he means. Intel's performance has indeed improved by over 70%, mostly as a result of adding 2 cores and another 30 watts TDP. And that is important because back in the Broadwell review we see that the 5775C was drawing 66 watts, whereas their fairly efficient actually 8700K was only drawing 86 watts. So that's only an increase of 31%. Pretty nice performance per watt, 74% extra performance at 31% more power. So indeed, Intel has made pretty nice improvement over the lifetime of their 14nm process, but make no mistake about it, the extra 2 cores were a massive factor in that. But what's possibly more important about this is that Intel's early 14nm was probably not that good. Not quite as bad as their early 10nm that we are seeing today. Broadwell had made 1 or 2 improvements over Haswell, although we also saw a reduction in clock speeds there, much like what we saw with 10nm. So it's an interesting point to think about. Coffee Lake is how Intel's 14nm should have been from the start. And it took them a very, very long time to get there. But moving on to definitely the most telling part here, when Murthy ends by saying, we are comfortable with the 14nm roadmap that will give us leadership products in the next 12 to 18 months as we seek to optimise the cost structure and yields of our 10nm portfolio. 14nm roadmap that will give them leadership products in the next 12 to 18 months. That is the end of 2019, by which point there will be no such thing as a leadership product coming out of Intel. They are kind of lacking leadership products today, so I'm not entirely sure why they think they're going to have it on the same process in 18 months' time. And over the page when Harlan pressed him on that time frame, when he asked was 10nm coming more first half or more second half next year, and it has to be said a pretty telling response, where Murthy again reiterated that they're actually shipping 10nm products today. But they've given themselves no specific timeline. It'll be when it makes better sense for Intel. So he thinks it's a little bit of wait and see. So it could be first or second half. But based on this, I think if we're going to see it in the first half, it'll be the first half of 2020. And next up was an interesting question where Harlan asks if, due to the 10nm delay, should we anticipate that the follow-on 7nm technology will be pushed out? Murthy replies, no, I think that's a premature assumption to make. There are different technical risk factors in 7 versus 10, and he goes on to again mention the 2.7 times scaling in an environment that wasn't assisted by EUV. That is extreme ultraviolet, which is a new technology coming at 7nm. And he says that they had to go to self-aligned quad patterning, that should be, not quad fastening, which in itself is both complex and time consuming. And he then goes on to say that 7 is basically going to be a slightly different balance between density, performance and power, and schedule predictability. And analysing this, what this almost certainly means, this 2.7 times scaling that they attempted between 14 and 10, they are not going to attempt anywhere near that between 10 and 7. They will also have EUV. Quad patterning is already done, and so the claim is 7 will not be anywhere near as difficult as 10. But you can probably guess that they said the same thing about 14nm and how 10 wouldn't be pushed out because of 14, and the stuff they brought in at 14nm would help them on their move to 10. The chances here, after all these problems on 14 and 10nm, Intel has gone for a rather timid shrink to 7 in order to try and close the gap to the foundries. This is what they mean by a slightly different balance point between density, performance and power, and schedule predictability. Harlan then moves on to talk about how this affects their 90% plus share leadership in the data center. That's more like 99% plus share, possibly 98% today. And he asks if the timing of the 10nm server and FPGA programs have also been pushed out. Because at a previous event, Intel did say that they had planned to drive servers on their 10nm++ technology. This was back in February 2017. Intel said the data center would be first to their new nodes, and Murthy replied by saying, clearly we haven't disclosed our 10nm server roadmap in any detail yet, but they're very excited by the product pipeline that they have, before saying, I'm equally excited by the products we would be launching this year and next year in 14nm on our data center roadmaps. 14nm not only for 2018, but also 2019. For server. Now I did say that the vast majority of this talked about Intel's manufacturing problems, and Harlan just continued to drive questions about the process. When he asks, are you going to have a 14nm, let's say With Murthy starting off with, it's a great question. And then he goes on to tell the story of how he's had 20 years of experience working in the fabless environment. And now he can also see Intel firsthand because he has had responsibility for the foundry activities there as well. One of the things that struck him most when he came to Intel was how it was all about one node and then roll out the next one and then roll out the next one and then the next one. Tick tock, tick tock. Intel just did this relentlessly for decades. There was none of this optimization stuff. It was process architecture. Tick tock. That's how it went. And he now says that one of the things about this 10nm experience, because they had so much trouble here, they were basically forced to improve 14. And this is something that you would take for granted if you worked at a TSMC or a Samsung or a Global Foundries. An example of this would be Global Foundries, or at this point this would actually be AMD, when they released their Phenom 2 architecture way back in early 2009. The flagship then was the X4940 Black Edition. I actually bought one of those, and it was a 3GHz, 125 watt CPU. But only 2 years later, the clock speed had increased by 20%. 3.6 GHz now for the X4975, and in fact it got to even 3.7 GHz with the X4980. So in 2 years, AMD had improved the process quite a lot. But what was possibly even more impressive was their move to their 6-core CPUs with their 1100T Black Edition, which had 6 cores at 3.3 GHz, 3.7 GHz turbo, and still at 125 watts TDP. That was less than 2 years after the original Phenom 2 940 Black Edition launched. 10% higher clock speed with 2 extra cores in under 2 years. So this is what Murthy's talking about when he says that these intra-node improvements are somewhat taken for granted elsewhere. But this was a real eye-opener for Intel at 14nm. And the reason for that was they simply didn't have to do it until that point. That is something that Intel will continue to focus on. This is not a one-off strategy for Intel, which is a nice way of saying TikTok is never coming back again. Now, to finish this interrogation off, Harlan talked about Intel's EMIB, their embedded multi-die interconnect bridge, which was actually introduced when Intel unveiled its first chips with AMD's Vega graphics. EMIB being used to connect the AMD GPU to the high bandwidth memory. The GPU and CPU, however, were connected using PCIe, and Murthy responded by talking about part of their data-centric strategy, which I just discussed, was that they were focused on moving their data center products nearer to the beginning of the launch of a process node. Now, this has been part of my argument for the past year, and Murthy goes on to talk about this now, where he says a lot of Intel's data center silicon has traditionally been very large, greater than 500 to 600 square millimeters, and that is a huge challenge at the beginning of a new node. You're really fighting defect density, which means very low yields, especially at the start of a new process. We already saw that they appear to be struggling with this tiny dual-core i3 on 10nm. This thing is going to be 50 square millimeters? Maybe less, I'm not entirely sure, but it's going to be very, very small, and they can't even yield half of it. The mere idea that Intel could yield something this large, 500 to 600 square millimeters, is just pure fantasy. And in fact, when I looked at it, I said, this 8-core Coffee Lake CPU, that is never going to be on 10nm either. It's simply too large. They can't yield this. They can't yield an 8-core CPU with a bunch of cache either. Forget it. So now Intel are going to use this EMIB for what they're calling a mix and match approach. And this is pretty interesting. We can see what it's going to look like here. With this large package of dies, presumably all connected using EMIB, and this could be CPU cores, this could be GPU cores, let's say both at 10nm. But this stuff around the edges, Murthy is saying that not everything that you see on the standard monolithic system on chip benefits equally from logic scaling. As I just said, the CPU and GPU clearly do. But there are many other elements on an SoC that maybe don't need the cutting edge technology. For example, high-speed I/O and memory controllers, they don't necessarily scale all that well anyway from process to process. So by doing this, Intel is now able to break down the design into smaller pieces of silicon that yield much earlier on the process curve. And it also means that they are no longer necessarily constrained in launching new products by basically waiting on all of the IP being ready at the same time. And that's what this mix and match is all about. You can have 10nm CPU cores, 10nm graphics, more likely to be 14nm graphics or 7nm graphics, from AMD. And everything else, all your I/O, your memory controls and stuff, they can remain on 14 nanometers or older manufacturing nodes. But this part was the most interesting part, where Murthy says that this really is a silicon bridge interconnect which allows you to essentially achieve virtually monolithic performance in a disaggregated approach. This is now beginning to sound an awful lot more like Infinity Fabric to me, which is something that perhaps earlier we weren't expecting. What this really comes down to is, can these be two different CPU complexes as well? Can this be 4 CPU cores, and can this be 4 CPU cores, and if so, does it give performance similar to a monolithic 8-core CPU? If Intel can pull this off, then EMIB packaging system is for sure a major benefit to them, but it really comes down to just how scalable their compute can be. Harlan finally goes on to talk about AMD, and AMD will also be my focus in the final part of this video. As at the same JP Morgan conference, Harlan Sur again was interviewing Dr. Lisa Su, President and CEO of Advanced Micro Devices, and here is a selection of what Lisa had to say.
And then we're also very active in the 7 nanometer process technology node, which should give us a very strong competitive advantage in our product line as we go through the next few years. The Zen 2 design is looking really good. We have completed the design now. We will be sampling that product later this year, and then you'll see production after that. Yeah, so we have not been specific about where that will be manufactured, but I think from the standpoint of our strategy on 7 nanometer, our strategy is to use both TSMC and Global Foundries, and we decide which manufacturing facility we use based on the readiness of the technology and the product. So, our 7 nanometer Zen 2 product is exactly on schedule, and we'll be announcing more about its manufacturing and, its performance later this year. When do we see our 7 nanometer EPIC shipping in volume? And then, given our competitors' delay in technology, does that give us an opening? I think to the first part of the question, we will sample this year 7 nanometer EPIC, and you should expect to see it in production 2019 in high volume. You should expect, significant volume in 2019. And then as it relates to the competitive landscape, we feel really good about the competitive landscape. When we planned our roadmap, we always do, scenario planning on, where the competition will be. And I think as it relates to where our 7 nanometer product is, we feel very good about where we're competitively positioned.
So while Intel is toiling with 10 nanometers, AMD is basically full steam ahead on 7. And let me just pick out some of the highlights of that, with Lisa saying that will give us a very strong competitive advantage over the next few years. Zen 2 is sampling later this year, with production after that. Significant volume in 2019 was what she said. So to me that kind of means around about the second quarter to the middle of 2019, when we should start to see the real Zen 2 EPIC ramp. The strategy is to use both TSMC and Global Foundries, and they will use whichever partner based on the readiness of the technology and the product. She again said that Zen 2 was exactly on schedule, and they will announce the fab partner and performance later this year. Now, in this EPIC master plan video I did 3 months ago, I said that the 7 nanometer EPIC would be fabbed at TSMC. I am sticking with that, although it's quite possible that EPIC will be fabbed at both TSMC and Global Foundries. And taking what Lisa said there about going with the fab that was ready earliest, in an interview over at EE Times India, the new CEO of Global Foundries, Tom Caulfield, when asked about whether or not Global Foundries would take mobile application processor business away from TSMC, he said this: "We don't have the capacity, and we will be behind the leading 7 nanometer foundry." In other words, TSMC's 7 nanometers will be ready first, with Global Foundries following later. How much later? Someplace between 3 and 9 months later. Just take the midpoint at 6 months. And that was basically the reason why I believed AMD would go with TSMC. Time to market here is absolutely paramount. AMD almost certainly fabbing EPIC at TSMC, first of all, with an overwhelming core count and basically performance advantage. As Lisa said herself, they scenario planned for where they felt their competitor would be compared to their 7 nanometer product. And at that point, when AMD was planning this, they would have expected Intel to have been quite a bit further ahead than where they were. And that is why Lisa says that AMD feels very good about their competitive positioning, because the 7nm power characteristics are just that much better than 14nm. And going back to that video 3 months ago, the EPYC master plan, I made the suggestion that EPYC would move from a 4-die configuration to a 5-die configuration, with my analysis being the center chip would be a controller chip surrounded by CPU cores. A lot of people did not like that idea. They did not like the idea of the memory controller being far away from the CPU cores, and at the JPM conference we also see that Intel are pretty much planning this as well. High-speed I/O memory controllers, they do not get the same kind of shrink, anywhere near as much as logic and cache. So it would appear that Intel are doing something similar here. You could be looking at CPU cores and possibly a separate memory controller die. It is very interesting to see how both companies went about the same problem in a different way, but it's crystal clear that AMD is already there in terms of architecture. We have seen nothing yet from Intel to suggest that any of this works from them. We're still not sure if Intel is capable of the same kind of scalability that we see with EPYC. And the last thing to say about this is, of course, the different manufacturing node sizes, where you can have 10nm CPUs and maybe a 14nm memory controller. I have also heard a rumour that AMD may be doing something similar with the upcoming Zen 2, which would be 7nm CPU cores and perhaps a 14nm control chip. This one should be much larger than the surrounding CPU cores, but 14nm is now yielding very well, whereas 7nm would be new. That's just some more information I got. Take it with a grain of salt. Right, so to sum this one up, Intel has effectively gone from tick-tock to this process architecture optimization, and we heard from Murthy himself that they will not be returning to tick-tock. On the other side, it looks like TSMC are pretty much unstoppable. Even Global Foundries now appear to be ahead of Intel. It has completely flipped around. Intel's process lead is gone completely. They've lost it. This 10nm that they are shipping today, it's a joke. It's the worst process we have ever seen. There's been some bad processes in history, but this 10nm will probably go down in history as Intel's worst ever node. And we saw from the Broadwell to the Skylake to the Kaby Lake to the Coffee Lake transition, it took their 14nm a very long time to truly get into shape. They're being very coy about when exactly 10nm will be in decent shape, but for me 2020 is the more likely date. There's a lot being said about their process, but in fact it's their architecture that's the real problem here. Even if their 10nm worked perfectly well, they've still got nothing to compete with EPYC scalability. 64 cores, 128 threads, very easily manufacturable. Unless their upcoming architecture does basically exactly the same thing, Intel is on a hiding. And it's the price they pay for years of technology stagnation. And their allies are deserting them in droves. At the same JPM conference, Lisa was talking about doubling the market share for Ryzen on desktop and mobile. I think she is probably being conservative. AMD clearly has the architecture, and it seems that 7nm is absolutely fine, regardless of TSMC or Global Foundries. And TSMC's 7nm will be the node to be on during 2019. It may not have the very best characteristics, but in terms of yield, manufacturability and characteristics altogether, and simple wafer starts, it will be the node to be on. Where that leaves Intel is anybody's guess. Even if they have the architecture, they are still dependent on fixing this 10nm. There is an awful lot that needs to go exactly right for them, and if it doesn't, they're basically finished. But that's me done for this one. It took a long time in getting out, and I also had a real problem with my Story My video. That has meant that this month has been pretty slow. My microphone actually broke down last week, and then I had a Fastco situation where both UPS and the Swedish postal system, PostNord, both of them failed to deliver my new microphone with their supposed guaranteed next day deliveries. So I only got my microphone yesterday, and that's basically allowed me to finish this video off today. But there's still a week left in May, and it is my intention to get a really good one out before the end of it. But don't forget to like and subscribe, check out all my links, my Amazon links in the description below, and I'll catch you later, guys.